Well, it is October 22nd, I think, 2025, and we're in the Coho channel studio with Tom Mitchell from Omni Mechanical. And Tom, thanks for joining us today. We're really, as soon as I conceived of this idea of doing a podcast for things that are going on in the construction industry in general, you're one of the first guys I thought about, because as we've gotten to know each other and work together, I just, feel like you're just such a consummate professional, and you just know the business.
I appreciate
So that if that doesn't embarrass you enough, we'll try harder next time.
I appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
And if I didn't say it before, this is Val Campbell, and you probably see that on the screen. But so Tom, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to start up Omni Mechanical.
Yeah, so I grew up kind of watching the mechanical industry. My dad's been a service tech at various companies around Seattle for, I don't know, 40 years, something like that. And got out of high school, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And there was the summer before I graduated, I'd done some mechanical. And so I was like, let's get into it and let's do this. And, maybe in 5 years, I'll figure out what I want to do. And then hopped around from different companies and ended up at a local, relatively, mid-size commercial contractor, and doing project management and sales and some installs and some service work, and got to the point where it just kind of made sense for us to, go out on our own and start kind of doing things the way we envisioned was the best way. So we started Omni, and now it's just been grinding it out ever since.
It is an adventure, isn't it? Starting your own business and going from dreaming and thinking about how you would want to do things, but then actually being in business and getting the opportunity, but also facing the struggle. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of that, right? I spent, I don't know, feels like my entire career thinking about exactly how I would have done this or that differently. And over the last maybe 10 years before I left, or maybe a little bit less, but around that amount of time, I was, earnestly kind of developing the model that I thought was going to work best. And, I don't know that I think up until 3-4 years ago, I probably would have said I still didn't want to do this for the rest of my life. And, we'll go find something else that is more interesting, or I shouldn't say that. There's lots of interesting, but something new, something.
I get it.
Something different. I don't know. I was never really sold on the mechanical business. It wasn't so much there's anything wrong with it. It was never that like, oh my gosh, I just love this, And so it's always, but I never really found that thing either. And so got to that point where I kind of always told myself, if I reach 35 and I never figured out what I really wanted to do, then probably should go do this by myself. I've probably been saying that since I was 20. And so now we over the last maybe 3 years before I finally left, it was a real kind of plan, not a for sure thing that was ever going to happen, but something that I was really thinking about a lot, and about how would I do it, what would I do differently, and what would it even look like. And then, to be honest, it took a push from one of my partners to actually do it. It was like sink or swim, now or never. Either we're doing it or we're not, and you take the jump and then see where you end up, and luckily we, that jump included a good starting project. So we had something to do right away and some income right away, but then it was, learning from there. The last company I was at was the last time I'd ever really been, or the first time I've ever really been in a managers type meeting. So that when I'd gotten to see some of kind of behind the curtain of the business side of how that worked. And I got my degree several years ago in business. And so it was kind of one of those things that felt like everything kind of led up to that moment. It was just making that final decision to jump.
Sure.
So.
You may know, I don't know if we ever talked about it, but I've done a lot of business consulting in my career. It's a big piece of my background, doing startups and turnarounds and a general business consulting, as I said. And so I think most people would be surprised at how often that is a very, very common thing. Entrepreneurs, they get ideas, and sometimes you end up working for a company or companies. And as much as anything over the years, you start developing a list of ways you wouldn't want to do it. And not to say that they're bad companies, but you just run into those things. You say, this is my company. I wouldn't do it this way. And then eventually you kind of end up in the position where, for one reason or another, you start a business. And like I said, it is interesting. It's very rare that I run into an entrepreneur, even in the most successful businesses, that'll sit there and look me in the eye and say, when I was a kid, the only thing I could ever think of was being a mechanical contractor. It's just what I always wanted to be. No, it's usually something else. In fact, it wasn't too long ago that somebody asked me what I wanted, and I said, well, I want you to send me my paycheck. I'm going to be on the beach in Hawaii. And he laughed and said, yeah, we don't have that deal here, but if it does pop up, I'm first in line. So that's just sort of the way it is. We do what we find out we're actually good at, and we can make some money to support our families. And sometimes that's the greater goal. Well, so as a contractor, it might be fun to go through and do another studio sometime on lessons you've learned getting into business and being an entrepreneur, because there's a lot of people out there going through that, right? Oh, yeah. And part of that is the economic environment that we're in, where people get laid off, and sometimes, and that's another thing. Sometimes you just don't have a choice. You just, you go into business because there's not a lot of other offers. And I will tell you, I don't know if this was your experience. I'm guessing perhaps not at your age, but you can get to an age, or you can get to a position of establishment within an industry where people don't want you around. They don't want to hire you because you're better than everybody there. And at your age, that might not have been the case, but trust me, if you'd have stuck around another 20 years as an employee, you would have gone there. You would have gotten to the point where you might be almost unemployable. So good. Congratulations. I just applaud you for taking that jump and getting in the deep end of the pool. And as they say, you're in shark infested water, so you got to swim now.
Yep.
Tell us what you see going on in the mechanical industry. I perceive that there are changes and things, and you would be a guy that could probably tell me about some of those.
Absolutely. It feels like, I've been in this industry, dedicated as my job since I was 18. So for 17 years. And then I, was into it the year before that. So for 18 years, this has pretty much been my life. And it feels like there's always something changing. When I first started in the industry, that I was doing residential, and the first major change was we were going to have to pressure test all the ductwork. And it felt seismic at the time. And, today's flavor is the refrigerant change. We're in the process, just getting out of the COVID, production problems and procurement problems and all of that. We're now at the point where, just like, a lot of people who are in construction remember back when R22 was phased out, R410A is now being phased out. And so it's going to come with some pain, kind of across the board. It's also coming with price increases, which is its own form of pain. But it's going to make jobs more difficult. It's going to make some jobs, I don't want to say impossible, but it's going to make them financially impossible. It's going to make some ways of construction have to change. The requirements, especially when it comes down to fire and things like that, because these new refrigerants are considered mildly flammable. It's going to require buildings to be designed with shafts that might not have had to have been designed with shafts. And it's going to require, new layouts. And in some cases, it might require mechanical or machinery rooms that weren't required in the past. And that's not without grossly changing anything else, right? The improvements we get in efficiency, in size of equipment and piping size, things like that, are relatively small compared to the changes that are coming because of the mild flammability. So yeah, that's probably the biggest seismic shift, but this is we seem to be on about a 3-year cycle with those codes with these major changes.
Well, actually, I used to be a code enforcement officer and continuing education officer for International Conference of Building Officials and WABO at the time, the Washington Association of Building Officials, and the code is on a 3-year cycle. It changes every 3 years, and then everybody scrambles to adopt, and there's a big lag on the part of the jurisdictions usually with that, and depending on what it is, there's some resistance. I don't perceive that there's going to be any resistance to this because of the nature of it, but I can tell you when the penetration fire stopping industry or code changes came about, that industry, the jurisdictions didn't want to adopt it. It was too difficult for them to inspect, and so they just chose to ignore it to their detriment sometimes. But that's a podcast for another day, isn't it? So what, so you're talking about one shift, one change that triggers some other changes. Are we pretty much done now, do you think, with the thermal upgrades on buildings, the insulation and thermal resistance upgrades? Because that's been a big one.
Yeah. No, I mean, if I'm being honest, I doubt it. A lot of this stuff goes back to a federal plan that's been in place for a long time that mandates how quickly we reduce energy consumption, especially in major metropolitan areas. But that's the source of the code, right? The code's design is to improve, specifically the energy code, but all codes are designed to improve the efficiency and the quality and the sustainability of new buildings and of remodel work that's done. So being realistic, until they've gotten to a point where there's a net zero loss at an exterior wall, I can't imagine innovation doesn't continue to happen. And obviously we get there, right? There is a zero U factor where we're losing nothing at the wall. But until we get there, whether it's minute changes or offsetting credits for other things, they're going to keep forcing us that direction. And that applies, to everything, wherever energy, especially wherever energy can be saved. But it's going to apply in other areas, just like our mechanical spins off shafts and these other things. Some of the things that it takes to get to these higher efficiency products are going to spin off other, auxiliary, possibly whole industries,
Yeah, there's a reason why I asked that question is because I was familiar with a project just recently, and that old system was an R22 system, right? R22, is that right? Yeah. And the mechanical contractor that I heard about in this situation came in and took a look at this and said, we can't bring this existing system up to what it needs to be because there was a couple of compressors that went down or something, and they said we could probably fix the compressors, but it's going to require replacing the refrigerant, and it's R22, and that's probably not going to happen. Getting it and the cost of it, right? I mean, you're the expert.
It's becoming cost prohibitive, especially on really big stuff. And then it's towing the line of benefit to repair something like that versus just replacing it once the cost gets to a certain point. So as they phase these things out, that's a lot of people's concerns about 410 now, is that it's going to become an equal problem. And then someday, because we're at a point now where no one produces R22 anymore. So right. At someday we run out of recycled refrigerant, right? We're not there because there's so much of it out there, but every time we take some out of an old system, we take it back and they recycle it and they sell it back to us in a new pretty bottle and we reinstall it, but eventually it leaks and eventually we run out. So someday will come a time where you won't even be able to get it. We're not there yet, but it's coming.
And from what I understand, that can be an expensive process, but then you like with anything, you have archaic technology and the systems don't work as efficiently anymore. So that's what happened in this particular situation. And because of the circumstances of this, as I'm told, it's causing the landlord and the tenants to step back and look at this structure and ask themselves, I don't think it's worth, the expense of all that's involved in dealing with this energy issue. And they're talking about tearing down a structure and the tenant having to go someplace else. And it just, that's a kind of a horrific shock to a business or an entity to have to go through that for that reason. It's just wasn't that it didn't work, the building didn't work, it wasn't whatever, it didn't fit the use description anymore and the code situation. So I think they're trying to evaluate what they're going to do. But what a mess! What a mess!
Yeah, and it's not uncommon for us to run into major upgrades being required for what seems like simple changes to a business or building or whatever it may be, and things that didn't used to be required are now required on things that haven't changed. Equipment that's no different than it was 30 years ago might require some additional work now that was not required when it was installed 30 years ago. Actually dealing with something similar right now where we're moving a piece of equipment, and when we move it, it's going to require us to now add an auxiliary piece to manage that piece. And the owner's not real happy about it, but unfortunately, as much as it does cause pain, right? That I think that's the best way I can describe it. It causes pain to the market, mostly really to individual customers. But it also, as a construction industry, these things also produce new opportunities, right? For us to get creative, for us to make more money too. I mean, I don't want to be callous about it. Obviously costs someone money, but this is the way business works, right? There's a cost to operate a business. And if you want to, improve your business, right? At least as far as I am aware, other than very, very large buildings, most of the time unless work is being done, you're not being required to upgrade, right? A lot of this has to do with what's changing. And so I know a lot of businesses that have scrapped plans for upgrades or expansions or additions because of things like this, because it wasn't, monetarily feasible. And I've had a couple come back around a few years later when it was, when they had grown to a point, and some people just realized they needed to increase their price, right? If you're working for a business and they want to do this expansion or need to, they say, okay, well, we've got to, maybe it's on our end. Maybe we raise our prices, we make a little bit more money, then we can afford our additional scope of work.
Yeah.
So,
but unlike some other types of building systems like partitions or carpet or paint or grid ceilings or something like that, MEPs, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, it's not always something you can kick down the road. I mean, sometimes it's like, well, the building has no heat.
Yeah.
So, it's going to be 12 degrees here in a few weeks. So, something's got to happen.
Oh yeah.
And
well,
go ahead. No, I was going to say we're not going to start having a fire and burning the office furniture or something like that to keep warm.
Yeah. No, and that's unfortunately that's been really seems like it's been a bad problem since COVID. Because it started with procurement problems, right? Then it was we can't get the stuff, and now it's we still have some of that going on, and a lot of industries that relied on distributors and warehousing and stuff like that now operate much closer to a built to order model. So COVID, you would have thought the businesses realized that all the problems that got created by running out of their stocks and not having manufacturing, but what they really did was just retool their process then coming out of it, because realizing that building stock at that time wasn't realistic. Now it probably would be, but then wasn't realistic because they were just selling it as fast as they could make it. They kind of switched to this. We're just going to build it and try, it sits on the floor for 2 weeks and it's out the door. And then we don't sit on any inventory. And as a business, that's probably better for them, but it certainly means that procurement becomes an issue. And now, with the 2021 code change that got adopted in 22, 23, now there's all these additional building requirements that are getting added in. And sometimes we can be creative, right? We can find loopholes, and we can, find exceptions in codes, or find different ways to do things, or emergency provisions, which do exist for some things. But to your point, there are some people who just end up in the Bermuda Triangle, as it were, of no solution, right? Your only option is some either major upgrade or a building tear, like you're saying, like a building tear down, because of the things that are required to meet code. And I will say, there is that part that says the code officials can accept an undue, hardship, basically, to allow a revised version. I personally have never used it. I've never seen something that was significant enough that I thought a code official would allow through. Usually if it's that expensive, it's also that important to the code, right? Some of these things are weighted differently. So unfortunately, I think we're due in for more with the refrigerant change. This thing's going to become a bigger problem, because existing piping in existing buildings where we would have just swapped equipment, when we went from 22 to 410, are now not going to be able to be swapped, because they don't have ventilated shafts, and they don't have, fire rated shafts for the refrigerant piping. It's just in the walls. And so this can become a lot bigger issue. We're going to run into this a lot more, where people can't just replace their equipment, even mechanically, not talking about other upgrade requirements.
I don't know how significant this is. But my sense from talking to a lot of people in the business community is that there still are a lot of businesses that are right on the edge. They've never really recovered from the trauma that they had. And even if they had a lot of business during COVID, I could think of a couple of them that I know that actually, benefited, if you want to call it that, by business increases during that period.
Mhm.
But even in that situation, their profitability might not have been tremendous. Sure, there was some, but the increased cost of supply chain issues and employee issues and et cetera, especially in this time when tradesmen and employees are becoming more and more difficult to find. It can be difficult. So how are you, what's your feeling on how the mechanical industry is doing with the employee challenge that exists in so many industries right now?
Yeah. We're new, we're small, we don't have that many employees, we haven't been through it for that long. We haven't had a problem, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I know, other people do. I think a better example would probably be an electrical company that I work with a lot. They've had some issues because the way that L&I requires them to find employees, basically, especially for small businesses, really limits their ability to go get them themselves.
Yep.
They have to get them from a school, and unless you have your own school, you can't find your own people, and that's a cost, right, that most small businesses can't afford. So they have to use these third parties, which means they're handed applicants. They're not able to source them themselves. And so I think that things like that have had a big impact and are hurting, especially electricians, but some industries. Mechanically, I mean, I did see, I think a lot of the problems we saw had to do with what you're looking for, right? So I think a lot of people are limiting their pool, right? And for good reason in some ways, but companies that don't like certain things or require certain things of their employees, especially the last 4 or 5 years, maybe not so much today, the last 4 or 5 years when everybody's busy and everybody's essentially hiring, environment culture becomes super important, right? To keep the employees you have and keep new ones you can find, and reputation. We all talk when we were, I was in the field and I was going to supply houses. We all talk. Everybody knows, at least the big players, who's good to work for and who's not. Because you talk to some guy, who works there or used to work there or has an opinion from the last 7 places he's worked. And so I think a lot of it has to do with that. It has to do with the following the market. We all think about following the customer market, but the employees are a market as well. They're out there shopping when it's good times. They're out there shopping companies the same way our customers are shopping companies. They're looking for the best environment, the best benefits, and the most money, you know? So I think that's some of it. And I think that there's a shift going on right now where, maybe in the 90s, everything kind of shifted. Everybody wanted to work in software. Everybody wanted to, be a computer scientist, and it made sense and all of that. And I think, I was just talking with someone this morning about how AI's the biggest threat from AI, at least in my understanding from the research I've done, is to software developers because of how much quicker AI can develop that software. And so I think a lot of people are shifting what they see as a goal. And I think a lot of the people who started mechanical and electrical and plumbing construction companies in the 80s and 90s did really well for themselves. And so I think that's set a role model for the next generation of people who may look at the trade as an option of what it could be, right? Software development was really touted in the 90s because of what happened with Microsoft. If you were a software developer in the 90s and were one of the first 10 at Microsoft, you're a billionaire, most likely, right? And so I think that was what everybody saw then. And I think now a lot of people see that, most of the, other than the ultra wealthy, the average wealthy person, a lot of them came from construction. They started in a trade, or they started as a general contractor, or a swinging a hammer as a framer, and just worked their way up. Eventually either bought a company or bought in or started their own. And I think those things will help, but I think it's going to take some time. I think we're still dealing with the repercussion of everybody go get a computer job,
Yeah. Well, we're seeing that shift a little bit. And I think we're going to see it more. There's still a resistance factor to blue collar when you're talking to kids, coming up through the teenage years. They're involved in gaming and, lots of online and pop cultural things. And, they may be enamored with some big maybe a personality in the esports or something like that. They're not generally thinking about construction, but we're starting to hear the conversations. We're starting to hear people telling their children, you need to stop thinking about going to college because it's enormously expensive and people aren't getting jobs, and you need to think about going into a trade. And my son's in his early to mid 40s, and he just literally set his company aside and went into the electrical industry as a union apprentice. And so far he likes it. Eventually he'll probably go through that process, and by the time he's in his late 40s, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he was an electrical contractor, because he's got that experience in his blood. You see, people are starting to think about this strategically, and I agree with you, especially in the licensed trades, MEPs, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. Those are licensed trades. It's not like being a drywall contractor or a painting contractor or an insulator. There's no barrier to entry there. In your trade, you got to get a license. You got to get a specialty license, and it's not like you just go down and pay your $300 and walk out the door. Correct?
Yes and no. Depends on the state you're in, for sure. In Washington, it's a little bit easier than in some other places, but there's still, it's not so much the state requirements here. It's more about the federal licensing requirements for refrigerant, and then there are individual licensing requirements in cities. So Seattle has gas piping and refrigeration licensing. The state doesn't, but city of Seattle does. And so we definitely there are hoops to jump through that far exceed anything a drywall contractor or a painter has to jump through. Or
a general contractor. You literally can go to Olympian for $300. You walk out the door, you're a general contractor, and you can go, start putting in numbers and doing. And I, as a consultant, I dealt with a lot of construction failures because of that. I knew one guy that was an insulation salesman. He just decided he wanted to be a general contractor, so he bought a license, and man, was there a trail of misery behind him. Yep. And because customers don't know. So you're not at least with your company, and I do perceive that the mechanical industry is in a better spot than perhaps the electrical industry. Although you do have a lot of specialization within your industry also. It's not just like, oh, we do HVAC. Mechanical covers a big territory if companies take on the whole thing.
Yep, absolutely.
But I know electrical right now is in a really interesting spot. It wasn't too many weeks ago, I was having a conversation with some of the apprenticeship council people on the union and non-union side. There's two divisions within that industry, and they had 1,000 journeyman electricians on the bench.
Yep.
In the Puget Sound area, and that's a lot of mechanics, and yet at the same time, which is a feature of the industry, they were recruiting apprentices.
Yep.
Because they had to have those apprentices in order to make the model work. And as the apprentices aged out to become journeymen, they went to the bench because there weren't any jobs for journeymen, and they were replacing them with apprentices. It's a little bit of a twisted model. I think there was probably some resentment amongst those journeymen.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of the end of that rope we were just talking about with my electrician friend, is that he has to have a specific ratio of journeymen to apprentices, or he has to have no apprentices. And so because of that, it's creating the exact problem you're talking about, right? You keep bringing on apprentices, they get to the journeyman level, which is supposed to be their goal, and then they don't have the work for that because the company still needs those second bodies that are cheaper and that can, that you repair with a journeyman, right? So you don't want to send two high dollar guys on a job. You send a lower dollar and a higher dollar guy. And everyone's always kind of operated that way. But by doing it this way, they kind of, I guess, pigeonhole all those, journeymen back into that. We can't get a job because we got to be on the list, So it's almost better when they weren't involved,
Well, and I have an interview appointment with a mutual friend of ours who's just recently become an electrical contractor within the last couple of years. A good guy. And when I asked him what subject did he think was of the most interest in the electrical industry, he didn't even bat an eye. He said the difficulty in finding qualified electricians.
Yeah.
And I said, well, but they're journeymen. He said, no. He said they might be a journeyman, but they're so specialized, and our industry is so diverse that to find the all-around guy is a real challenge, and that's what we need. Or else we have to hire a guy, and he can do what we're doing this week, but then next week he can't do what we're doing there.
Yep.
And is it at a journeyman's rate? The carpenters and some of the other trades are trapped into this also.
Yeah.
That you hire somebody and they can only do what you're doing for the next 2 weeks, and then they can't do that next thing. And at that wage rate and with the speed what they're required, you can't train them. There's not enough time, because then for the next 2 weeks you're going to be doing something, then next 2 weeks you're going to be doing a third thing, and it just doesn't pencil out when you keep losing that productivity to try and train somebody at the wage rates those are. And I've talked to a lot of carpenters that are very, very frustrated with this. They can't stay on with any company because they just don't know how to do most of the work. They know how to do one piece really well. You don't run into that much in mechanical?
Not really, just because, in all the places I've worked actually over the years, the number of qualified, meaning some to a lot of experience, the number of people that were hired at all the places I worked was pretty small. There might have probably could count on two hands how many people I started to work with at a company that already knew something. Usually all the new hires that came in were little to no experience. And that's a model, right? The companies I've worked for would prefer to train their guys from scratch and have people do it their way. And it's a good model. I like that model. It's one that's not afforded to electricians, and I guess carpenters with this apprenticeship model, because they can't, go find their own employees, which makes, all of this a bit of a problem. But we run into it when it comes down to I see it more on the service side of things, right? Service is a little harder to train employees on. And so there you're usually getting guys out of school, or sometimes you're getting an more experienced guy. And
why, let me interrupt you and say, why is that more difficult to train?
because most service companies and the model that service is set up with is a one man in a van model.
I was gonna say that's a real issue with carpenters. Too often we have someone who needs to go out to a job site and do a certain thing and work by himself or with maybe one other person who's a helper, and the skill levels just aren't there. They're just, so that's interesting that you brought that up. Go ahead, please.
No, that's that the service side of it is definitely more difficult because of that. You really need to find someone, and I kind of in hiring have focused on attitude over aptitude. And it does make for some more struggles, but in the service world, it takes a specific kind of person, in my eyes, right? You can train anyone to follow a book or read a manual, but it takes someone who's curious enough to want to know why it's happening the way it's happening and to want to figure things out. And if you have the right guy, I don't want to say they'll train themselves, but it takes less work and it's less difficult to get them to a point of being on their own. And then once they're on their own, usually things like industry classes and projects that require more than one person will give them the rest of the training they need to get to the point of being fully qualified. We run into a problem a lot with, I don't want to say we want to do everything, but we try to be people's solution. So our problem becomes that we, are used to touching new things that we haven't touched before. And it's a good and a bad thing. And it also requires us to have specific types of people, right? Lots of guys don't want to do that. They'd rather work on the same type of thing over and over again. And that's the way it's been, to your point about specialization. The residential guys did the residential systems. And if you wanted a boiler, you had to almost go find a boiler contractor, somebody who really specialized in that. Some companies did both, but for the most part, and I'm not going to say it's really changed much residentially. If you want radiant flooring, there's a few ways to do it, but if you're doing it with a with a boiler, oftentimes you're going to someone who specializes in that, residentially speaking. Commercially, though, there are a lot of different system types, and it's really hard to say, I'm not going to go work in that building, right? So we have to get used to understanding the processes that drive the equipment. I think that's what changes it. If you get a guy who understands the thing behind it, then he can apply that blueprint to multiple things. And so for us, I think what we run into a lot is that it's finding the right person, not just someone who wants to work hard in construction. That's what we need a lot. But in service, you really need someone who's got the right mentality. And
personality.
Personality, mentality, all of that. I just haven't really been on the hiring end of that yet. We haven't pushed as hard into our service side. And so far the guy we've got does have the right personality, and all of that. So I think that's where, we'll probably run into a little bit more struggle. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle. But I think that's where we got to compensate as business owners with creating that desirable place to work. Right.
Yep.
I really think about it just like I have two stores. I get a store that sells mechanical and I get a store that sells jobs. And both of them have to attract customers, right? Both of them have to be compelling, and the market sets both rates, right? The market sets what I got to do for my employees and what I need to do for my customers to be at the top of both lists for people to call. And so, we've done a lot of things in our short time to try and become equal to our competitors, right? Because if we want to attract employees, that's what we have to do. We have to offer similar benefits. Even as a small new company, things like health insurance are going to lock you out of a huge percentage of the employees that are available out there. Retirement and vacation and all of those things that are, somewhat monetary or non-monetary to an employee, they matter. Even if you can't quite pay as much as some of the biggest guys out there, some people would rather be a big fish in a small pond, and so you can get them if you can offer a similar similar benefit package, and maybe and an inline wage, if not an equal wage.
Sure.
Um,
Two things. One, in my business development models that I work on, I've always focused on the phrase most desirable. And if you can design an organization, and you touched on it, I think it's brilliant, quite frankly. If you can design an organization and operate it such that you are most desired by employees, by vendors, by subs, this might be, by customers, you have something there that's very, very difficult to deny. That everybody wants you. I know that sounds simple, but of course, everybody wants you. Sure. It's not easy to carry that off because of sometimes conflicting orientations, conflicting situations there. So that's good. But you mentioned boilers, and we've encountered quite a bit of work with the Archdiocese of Seattle. They've got a lot of old buildings. There's a lot of old boilers. And in one of my conversations with one of their people there not too long ago, they commented that they are having a really hard time finding companies and technicians today that know how to work on old boilers. It's just not the old boiler maker thing isn't a trade anymore, I guess.
It isn't. No, it really isn't. I mean, especially to your point, the old boiler maker trade, that trade doesn't exist. There are boiler installers now, but you really got to think about the average in-floor new system boiler installer today as something closer to a plumber.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? Much less of a mechanical person as a pipe fitter, right? They do a lot of piping, and I don't want to discredit them. They have knowledge about boilers. I'm certainly not saying they don't. But modern boilers are much closer to what a gas furnace is with a different heat exchanger, right? We're changing gas to air rather than gas to air rather than gas, or gas to water instead of gas to air.
And in some cases, isn't it almost more like an Insta-Hot situation? Something like that.
Oh yeah. That's
on demand.
I would say 80 to 90% of the ones installed today are going to be that, if not more. And commercially speaking, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know that I could find someone to work on a 1950s boiler. That's, it all kind of depends
or a 1920s in the case of a lot of these archdioceses. These are old buildings.
Oh yeah. Well, and some of them have been upgraded, and that changes things, right? If you've got a gas upgrade on a boiler, then it does change things. There are some things that are still going to be kind of out of the imagination of the normal technician, but if you've got a gas conversion, it brings it a lot closer to what they deal with today. And so it's going to be a lot easier for someone to extrapolate from their knowledge of today backwards. But yeah, I've seen and replaced several that era, 1920s, 1950s, 1960s boilers. And just thinking through the image of those, monstrosities, these things can be train car sized or bigger.
Yes, they're big. And there are none of there's not really any of the 1920s era, let's just call it that, boilers that are operating as they did then. But I ran into this not long ago in a project I took a look at, and we were talking to them, and of course some of the room structures were still down there in the basement, right? Mm-hmm. You go in and they say, well, this is the coal room. And there was a coalman down there who spent all day shoveling coal into this furnace, this fireplace there that heated the boiler that ran the steam or whatever all the way through this building. And then and there's this is the coal chute where they opened up and they dumped the coal down into the basement. And I thought, man, I'm not unhappy that we don't have those situations anymore. That was a nasty job. Man,
well, and that's just it. There's a lot of talk about jobs and industries disappearing. In 30 years, the world's going to look 100% different, just like it does from 30 years ago, and even more so from 60 years ago. And, to your point, we'll be looking back on some of the things we're doing today going, I can't believe we used to do that. I can't believe it used to be that way.
Well, I make a lot of videos and a lot of situations talking about the changes going on in the world and the changes that will be going on in the world today. And you are 100% correct. This world is going to change faster in the next 20 to 30 years than it has in the last 500.
Yep.
And people get it. I talk to people about that, and they don't, it doesn't register with them what all of these population dynamics and technology and economic curves do when they all come together at a point in time of history, which looks like it's around 2030, and what a shift that time in history is going to be. And it's going to be extremely stressful. People don't adjust to massive paradigm shifts that fast. They don't do it well. It's, we want to hang on. We want to be stable. This is not going to be a very stable time in history. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come visit with us and talk about some of the dynamics of the mechanical industry and HVAC in particular, and some of the things that you're going through as a relatively new business owner. It's been a couple of years now, right?
Yep.
And I congratulate you. I've found it very enjoyable to work with you always. You respond. You actually return phone calls, which is like amazing. And I always also said, if you ever want to differentiate yourself in the business world, just return a phone call. That's just right there.
Oh, yeah.
So Thomas Mitchell, built for more. It says there. What does that mean? Built for more.
Well, I've been a tinkering entrepreneur for years and years and years, and that was the thing I did 15 years ago, and
it's still there.
My Google is still attached to it. I thought I got it cleared out because I've gone through all these meetings over the last several years since I started the business.
No worries. You got to get Omni Mechanical up there. We got to get.
Oh,
there.
yeah.
All right, my friend. It's been great. I appreciate you so much. And as always, if there's anything I can do for you, you just give me a call and let me know.
Us too.
All right, talk to you later. Yeah.
Yep.
Bye.
Sure.